The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, casting a golden hue over the countertops. I stood at the sink, absently rinsing the last of the dishes, letting my mind drift. It was always like this when he left. My husband, Mark, had been gone for 3 days, attending yet another business trip, leaving me to the quiet monotony of our suburban home. We'd been married for 8 years, but lately it felt like we were more like two polite roommates sharing a space, rather than a couple deeply in love. I wiped my hands on a towel and leaned against the counter, scrolling mindlessly through my phone. Social media was no distraction. Pictures of happy couples on vacation or posts about adorable children only made the empty space in my heart feel larger. The house was too quiet. Even the hum of the fridge seemed louder than it should be. That was when the knock came. It startled me, the sharp raps against the door, cutting through the silence. I wasn't expecting anyone. My pulse quickened slightly, an automatic reaction to the unexpected. Dropping the towel, I moved toward the door, peeking through the peephole. A delivery man stood there, holding a large box. His uniform clung to his muscular frame, and his brown hair was slightly tousled, as if he'd been out in the wind all day. But it was his eyes that gave me pause. Warm, inviting, and unexpectedly intense. "Mrs. Collins?" he asked when I opened the door. His voice was deep but smooth, with a friendly lilt that made my stomach flip in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. "Yes, that's me," I said, hoping my face wasn't as flushed as it felt. "I've got a package for you. Looks pretty heavy. Want me to bring it in?" "Oh, sure. Thank you." I stepped aside, suddenly aware of how disheveled I looked in my oversized sweatshirt and leggings. He brushed past me, carrying the box with ease, his cologne trailing behind him, a mix of cedar wood and something else I couldn't quite place. I watched as he set the box down on the kitchen table, his movements fluid and deliberate. For a brief moment, the sight of his strong, veined hands distracted me. I shook the thought away. "Sign here, please," he said, holding out a clipboard. His fingers grazed mine as I took it, the brief contact sending an unexpected shiver up my spine. "Thanks," I murmured, quickly scrawling my name. "You're welcome." His lips curved into a smile, the kind that felt like it held a secret. "Have a nice day, Mrs. Collins." "You too," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. As he left, I stood frozen in the doorway, watching him walk down the path to his truck. There was something about the way he moved, confident, unhurried, that captivated me. It wasn't until he disappeared down the street that I realized I'd been holding my breath. I closed the door, leaning against it as my heart thudded in my chest. It was just a delivery, I told myself. Nothing more. And yet, as I looked at the package sitting on the kitchen table, I couldn't shake the way he'd made me feel. Noticed. Seen. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. The days passed in their usual rhythm, but my mind kept drifting back to him. The delivery man. I hadn't even asked his name, but his face was etched in my memory as clearly as if I'd taken a photograph. It was ridiculous, I knew. He was just doing his job. Yet the warmth of his smile and the way his gaze seemed to linger longer than necessary made it hard to forget. Mark's nightly phone calls were brief and impersonal. "How was your day?" he'd ask, distracted by the sound of clinking glasses or murmured voices in the background. I would answer with a polite "fine," though what I really wanted to say was, "It's lonely without you." But I didn't. Somewhere along the way, we'd stopped saying those things to each other. On the third day after the delivery, I was cleaning out the pantry when I found an old, nearly expired bag of flour. I sighed, thinking about how I'd have to bake something soon to avoid wasting it. The thought sparked an idea, a small one, but enough to set my heart racing. What if I ordered more supplies, something I didn't really need, something that might require another delivery? It was absurd, and yet I found myself opening my laptop before I could second guess it. I clicked through the online grocery store, adding a few items to my cart: baking powder, sugar, a new loaf pan. None of it was urgent, but it was enough to justify placing the order. The knock came the very next afternoon, just as I was folding laundry in the living room. My pulse quickened at the sound, my hands fumbling with the neatly folded towels. I smoothed my hair and tried to steady my breathing before opening the door. And the door was open, sinuously moving, and a man swimming himself closer to me. The skin on my neck cooled. It was him. "Mrs. Collins," he said, smiling as he held up another box. "Looks like you're keeping me busy this week." I laughed nervously, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. "Well, I guess I like to stay stocked up." "Smart," he said, stepping inside when I motioned toward the kitchen. "Never know when you'll need extra supplies." As he set the box down, I noticed his gaze wandering briefly over the room before settling on me. "Do you bake a lot?" he asked, nodding toward the ingredients listed on the side of the box. "Sometimes," I said, shrugging. "It's more of a hobby, really. Something to pass the time." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Must be nice to have hobbies. I never seem to have the time for that kind of thing. What keeps you so busy?" The question slipped out before I could stop myself. He chuckled, leaning casually against the counter. "Work, mostly. And life, I guess. But delivering packages isn't exactly exciting." I smiled, feeling a strange, unexpected ease in his presence. "Well, you make it look effortless." His eyes met mine, and for a moment, the air between us seemed to shift. It was a fleeting moment, but it left me breathless. "Well," he said, breaking the spell as he straightened. "I'd better get going. Lots of deliveries today." "Of course," I said, walking him to the door. "Thanks again." "Any time," he replied, his smile lingering just a little too long before he turned and walked away. As I watched him leave, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that I was playing with fire. But the warmth in my chest wouldn't let me regret it. Not yet. The doorbell rang again 3 days later, mid-morning, as I was halfway through dusting the bookshelves in the living room. My heart skipped a beat. I knew it was him. Even though I tried to convince myself that this delivery would be mundane, just like the rest, a nervous excitement coursed through me as I wiped my hands on my jeans and hurried to the door. When I opened it, there he was, standing in the soft autumn sunlight, another box cradled in his arms. His eyes lit up when he saw me, a reaction I couldn't help but notice. "Mrs. Collins," he greeted, that familiar smile playing on his lips. "I'm starting to think you're keeping me in business." I laughed, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "I guess I'm just lucky to live in your delivery zone." He tilted his head slightly, as if he were about to say something but thought better of it. "This one's a little heavier. Mind if I bring it inside again?" "Of course, thank you." I stepped aside, acutely aware of how close he was as he brushed past me. The scent of his cologne, woodsy, rich, and intoxicating, filled the air, and I had to remind myself to breathe. He carried the box to the kitchen, setting it down on the table with ease. "What are you baking this time?" he asked, nodding toward the package. "Oh, probably something simple," I said, attempting a casual tone. "I'm not exactly a master chef." "I don't believe that for a second," he replied, his grin widening. "You seem like the kind of person who could make magic in the kitchen." The compliment, innocent as it was, sent a flutter through my chest. "You give me too much credit," I said, trying to hide my smile as I picked up a pair of scissors to cut the box open. As I fumbled with the tape, he stepped closer. "Here, let me help," he offered, reaching for the scissors. His hand brushed against mine, and though the contact lasted only a second, it felt electric. I froze, my breath catching as his fingers lingered just a moment too long. "Thanks," I murmured, stepping back to let him take over. He sliced through the tape with practiced ease and opened the box, revealing the neatly packed ingredients inside. "You're all set," he said, glancing at me with a smile that made my knees feel unsteady. "Thanks again," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "No problem. It's nice to have a reason to slow down for a minute," he said, leaning casually against the table. His gaze lingered on me, warm and inviting, and for a moment, the space between us seemed to shrink. "Do you always work this hard?" I asked, desperate to fill the silence. He chuckled, shaking his head. "It's not hard work, really, but it can get lonely, just driving around all day, dropping things off. It's nice when someone actually takes the time to chat." "Well, I'm sure you meet a lot of interesting people," I said, feeling a pang of guilt for how much I was enjoying his company. "Not as interesting as you, Mrs. Collins," he said, his tone light but his eyes serious. I didn't know how to respond. The weight of his words hung in the air between us, charged with an unspoken tension that neither of us seemed willing to address. I could feel my cheeks flushing, and I turned away, pretending to busy myself with rearranging the items in the box. "I should probably get going," he said after a moment, his voice softer now. "I wouldn't want to overstay my welcome." "You're not," I said quickly, then caught myself. "I mean, I appreciate the help." He smiled, but there was something in his expression that made my heart ache. An understanding, as if he knew the internal struggle I was trying so hard to hide. "Have a good day, Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice low and warm. "You too," I replied, watching as he walked toward the door. Just before he stepped outside, he turned back, his eyes meeting mine one last time. "By the way, my name's Ethan," he said, as if it were an afterthought. "Ethan," I repeated, the name lingering on my tongue like a forbidden secret. The days seemed longer after that. Mark's brief calls in the evenings felt emptier, his voice distant even when he asked about my day. I would give vague, polite answers, leaving out the parts that mattered, the parts I couldn't stop thinking about. I didn't order anything else for a week, trying to convince myself that I didn't need to see him again. But the memory of his smile, the warmth in his voice, and the way his eyes had seemed to look right through me haunted my thoughts. I felt like a teenager with a hopeless crush, and it both thrilled and terrified me. It wasn't until the following Friday that I gave in. I justified it to myself as a necessity. We were low on coffee beans, and I had been meaning to replace the cracked baking dish for months. I placed the order late at night, my heart pounding as I clicked submit. The next afternoon, I heard the now familiar sound of the delivery truck pulling up in front of the house. I tried to calm my nerves as I opened the door, but the sight of Ethan standing there, another package in hand, made my pulse race. "Mrs. Collins," he said, his tone carrying a hint of amusement, "we've got to stop meeting like this." I laughed, hoping it didn't sound as nervous as I felt. I- What can I say? I'm a woman of routine. He stepped inside, setting the box on the table as he always did, but this time, instead of leaving immediately, he lingered. "You know," he said, leaning against the counter, "I think I might be jealous of all the attention your kitchen gets." I blinked, caught off guard by his playful tone. "What do you mean?" "Well," he said, his smile widening, "you've been spending so much time baking, I'm starting to think I should get in line for a slice of whatever you're making." His words, harmless on the surface, carried an undertone that sent a thrill through me. "Maybe I'll save you a piece next time," I said, surprising myself with the boldness in my voice. "I'd like that," he said, his gaze holding mine for a beat too long. The tension between us was palpable now, a silent current that neither of us seemed willing or able to ignore. For a moment, the rest of the world seemed to fall away, leaving just the two of us in the quiet, sunlit kitchen. "I should go," he said finally, his voice softer now. "Oh," I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "Thank you, Ethan." He hesitated, as if he wanted to say something more, but instead he simply smiled and turned toward the door. As I watched him leave, I felt a strange mixture of longing and guilt settle over me. I knew I was treading dangerous ground, but I couldn't deny the spark that Ethan had reignited in me, a spark I hadn't felt in years. The weather turned cooler as the days passed, crisp autumn breezes sweeping through the neighborhood and scattering leaves across the lawn. I tried to distract myself with chores, errands, and even a long overdue call to an old friend. But no matter how busy I kept myself, Ethan's face lingered in my mind. His name had become a quiet refrain in my thoughts, a subtle echo that refused to fade. I told myself it was innocent, a harmless crush born out of loneliness and routine. But deep down, I knew better. There was something about Ethan that drew me in, a magnetic pull that felt impossible to resist. The next time the doorbell rang, it was late afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. I opened the door to find him standing there, holding a smaller package this time. His smile was as warm as ever, but there was something different about the way he looked at me, something that sent a shiver down my spine. "Mrs. Collins," he greeted, his tone light but his eyes serious. "You've been busy." "Guilty as charged," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. "I hope you don't mind the extra work." "Not at all," he said, setting the package on the counter. "Keeps things interesting." As he straightened, our eyes met, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that seemed to fill the room. "Do you have time for a coffee?" The words tumbled out of my mouth before I could stop them. "I mean, if you're not in a rush." Ethan's smile widened and he nodded. I could use a break. I busied myself at the coffee maker, my hands trembling slightly as I measured the grounds and poured the water. When I turned around, he was leaning against the counter, watching me with intensity that made my pulse quicken. "So, Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice soft but steady, "what do you do when you're not baking up a storm or keeping the delivery guys on their toes?" I laughed nervously, brushing a stray hair from my face. Not much, honestly. My husband's job keeps him away a lot, so it's just me most of the time." His expression shifted, a flicker of understanding passing through his eyes. That must be tough. I shrugged, handing him a mug. You get used to it. We sipped our coffee in silence for a moment, the quiet punctuated only by the hum of the fridge and the faint rustle of leaves outside. It felt strangely intimate, standing there with him in the fading light, as if the world outside didn't exist. You know, he said finally, setting his mug down, you deserve more than getting used to it. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and I felt my cheeks flush. It's not so bad, I said, avoiding his gaze. Still, he said, his tone gentle but firm, everyone deserves to feel appreciated. I looked up then, meeting his eyes. The air between us felt heavier somehow, the space shrinking, as if we were being pulled closer by some invisible force. Ethan, I began, but the words caught in my throat. He stepped forward, just a small movement, but it was enough to send my heart racing. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to overstep. You didn't, I said quickly, the words slipping out before I could think them through. For a moment we just stood there, the silence stretching between us, and then, as if drawn by the same irresistible pull, we both moved at once. Our lips met, tentative at first, a soft brush that sent a jolt of electricity through me. I froze, torn between the rush of exhilaration and the weight of guilt pressing down on my chest. But when his hands came up to cradle my face, I couldn't pull away. The kiss deepened, and for those brief, breathless moments, nothing else mattered. Not Mark, not the consequences, not the lines we were crossing. It was just us, two people finding solace in each other's arms. When we finally broke apart, I couldn't bring myself to look at him. I'm sorry, I murmured, my voice trembling. Don't be, he said softly, his thumb brushing against my cheek. I've wanted to do that since the first time I saw you. His words sent a thrill through me, but they also brought reality crashing back down. I stepped back, wrapping my arms around myself as if to shield against the storm of emotions raging inside me. This can't happen, I said, more to myself than to him. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. I understand. But as he turned to leave, I reached out, my hand catching his arm. Wait. He paused, looking back at me with a mixture of hope and hesitation. Thank you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, for reminding me what it feels like to be seen. He smiled then, a soft, bittersweet curve of his lips. Anytime, Mrs. Collins. And with that he was gone, leaving me alone in the quiet kitchen with nothing but the fading warmth of his touch and the echo of his words. The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions. Guilt gnawed at me every time I thought of Mark, but the memory of Ethan's kiss was a constant presence, haunting my thoughts in a way that both thrilled and terrified me. I tried to throw myself into my usual routines, but nothing felt the same. The house felt emptier, the silence heavier, as if some part of me had been awakened that I couldn't put back to sleep. I didn't order anything else for over a week, afraid of what might happen if I saw Ethan again, but deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time. The days stretched on, each one longer than the last. I tried to keep busy, scrubbing every surface in the house until my hands were raw, organizing the pantry twice, and even tackling the overgrown hedges in the backyard. But no matter how hard I worked, the quiet moments crept in, bringing with them thoughts of Ethan, his smile, the warmth of his hands, the way he'd kissed me as though I were the only thing in the world that mattered. Mark called more often that week, but his voice felt like it belonged to a stranger. "How's everything at home?" he'd ask, his tone perfunctory, as if he were checking off a box. "Fine," I'd reply, my chest tightening with the weight of the lie. On the 8th day, I couldn't take it anymore. I convinced myself it was innocent, that I just wanted to see him, to hear his voice and maybe exchange a few harmless words. I placed another order late at night, my hands trembling as I clicked through the checkout process. A part of me hated how desperate I felt, but another part, the part that had come alive with Ethan, craved the connection. The doorbell rang the next afternoon, its sharp chime slicing through the oppressive silence of the house. I wiped my hands on my jeans, took a deep breath, and opened the door. Ethan stood there, holding a slim box. His expression shifted when he saw me, surprise flickering across his face before it softened into a smile. "Mrs. Collins," he said, his tone carrying a warmth that made my heart skip a beat. "Back at it again?" "Call me Claire," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. His smile widened and he nodded. "All right, Claire." The sound of my name in his voice sent a shiver down my spine. I stepped aside to let him in, the now familiar scent of his cologne filling the space as he brushed past me. He set the package on the kitchen counter and turned to face me, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. "You know," he said, his tone teasing, "you're quickly becoming my favorite customer." I laughed, a nervous, breathless sound. "I'll take that as a compliment." "You should," he replied, his gaze holding mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that seemed to grow with every second. I could feel the pull, the invisible thread that had been drawing us closer since the first time we met. And this time, I didn't want to resist. "I should get going," Ethan said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "Wait," I said, stepping forward before I could lose my nerve. He froze, his eyes searching mine. "Claire?" Before he could finish, I closed the distance between us, my hands reaching for him almost instinctively. His lips met mine, soft and warm, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. This kiss was different from the first, deeper, more urgent, as though we were both starving for something we couldn't name. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened. I melted against him, every nerve in my body, alight with a sensation I hadn't felt in years. For a moment, I allowed myself to forget everything else, the guilt, the consequences, the life waiting for me outside this fleeting moment. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless. Ethan's forehead rested against mine, his hand still firm on my waist. "This is crazy," he murmured, his voice low and ragged. "I know," I whispered, my fingers gripping his shirt as though letting go would break me. "We shouldn't." He trailed off, his lips brushing against my temple. "But I can't seem to stop." "Neither can I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes searching mine. "Claire, I don't want to make things harder for you." "You're not," I said quickly, though we both knew it wasn't true. "This isn't your fault." For a moment, he seemed torn, his gaze flickering between my eyes and my lips. Then he sighed, stepping back reluctantly. "We have to be careful," he said, his tone heavy with regret. "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek in a gesture so tender it made my chest ache. "You deserve to be happy," he said quietly. "Don't forget that." And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the quiet kitchen once again. I stood there for a long time, my fingers brushing against my lips as I replayed the moment over and over in my mind. The next week passed in a haze. Mark returned home for a brief visit, his presence a stark reminder of the life I was supposed to be living. I tried to act normal, but every touch, every kiss felt hollow, as though I were going through the motions of someone else's life. Ethan stayed away during that time, though I couldn't stop thinking about him. I found myself scrolling through the delivery app late at night, staring at the place order button and wondering if he was thinking about me too. On the day Mark left again, the house felt unbearably empty. The weight of the silence pressed down on me, and before I could stop myself, I placed another order. When Ethan arrived the next day, there was no playful banter, no teasing smiles. Instead, he looked at me with an intensity that took my breath away. "Claire," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, "we need to talk." I nodded, my heart pounding as I closed the door behind him. "I know." "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice low but firm. "Not unless I know where we stand." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I looked at him, my chest tightening with a mixture of fear and longing. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." He stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. "Then figure it out," he said gently, "because I can't keep pretending this is nothing." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes as I looked up at him. "I'll try." He smiled then, a bittersweet curve of his lips. "That's all I can ask." And with that, he was gone, leaving me to grapple with the storm of emotions raging inside me. The days after Ethan's departure felt heavier than usual. His words lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of the tangled web I had created. I went about my daily routine mechanically, trying to avoid thinking about the implications of what we had shared, or what I had to decide. Mark's calls were now filled with updates about upcoming conferences and meetings. His voice seemed distant, more like a background noise than a connection to the man I had married. The void between us felt insurmountable, and I couldn't stop myself from comparing his monotony to Ethan's warmth, his distance to Ethan's attentiveness. But even as I struggled with my feelings, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't let things continue like this. I needed to see Ethan. I needed clarity. The doorbell rang late one evening, its chime cutting through the oppressive silence of the house. My stomach tightened. I hadn't placed an order, but somehow I knew it was him. When I opened the door, Ethan stood there, his expression unreadable. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "No," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. "You're not?" He walked into the kitchen, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. The tension between us was palpable, a silent current that made the air feel heavier. I closed the door and leaned against it, my arms crossed over my chest. "Claire," he began, turning to face me, "I know this is complicated, and I don't want to make things harder for you, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel something real." His honesty took my breath away. I had spent so long trying to bury my own feelings. to convince myself that this was just a fleeting distraction. Hearing him say the words out loud made it impossible to ignore the truth. "I feel it too," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But I don't know what to do about it." Ethan closed the distance between us in 2 steps, his hands reaching for mine. "Then let's figure it out together," he said softly. "I don't care how messy it is. I just know I can't stay away." The vulnerability in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes undid me. Without thinking, I leaned into him, my head resting against his chest. He wrapped his arms around me, holding me tightly as though he were afraid I might slip away. For a moment, we stood there in the quiet kitchen, the only sound the soft hum of the fridge and the faint rustle of leaves outside. His warmth enveloped me, and I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. When I looked up at him, his gaze was filled with an intensity that made my heart race. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. I responded without hesitation, the weight of my guilt momentarily forgotten as I lost myself in the moment. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of stolen kisses and whispered confessions. We stayed in the kitchen, talking late into the night about everything and nothing. He told me about his dreams, his frustrations with his job, and the loneliness he had carried for so long. I shared pieces of myself I hadn't revealed to anyone, not even Mark. "It's like I'm invisible," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Mark doesn't see me anymore, not really." Ethan reached for my hand, his fingers brushing against mine. "You're not invisible to me," he said firmly. "You've never been." His words were a balm to the ache I had carried for so long. I felt seen, understood in a way I hadn't experienced in years. But as the night wore on and reality began to seep back in, the weight of our actions became impossible to ignore. "This isn't fair to you," I said, pulling away slightly. "You deserve someone who can give you all of themselves." He shook his head, his grip on my hand tightening. "Oh, don't do that," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Don't push me away because you're scared." "I don't want to hurt you," I said, tears stinging my eyes. "You won't," he said, his tone resolute. "But you'll hurt yourself if you keep pretending you don't deserve to be happy." His words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the choices I had to make. I nodded slowly, my chest tightening with the weight of my emotions. "I need time," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan exhaled, his expression softening. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." He leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead before stepping back. "Good night, Claire," he said, his voice filled with a quiet tenderness that made my heart ache. "Good night, Ethan," I replied, watching as he turned and walked out the door. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. I replayed our conversation over and over in my mind, torn between the life I had built with Mark and the connection I had found with Ethan. I knew I couldn't keep straddling the line between the two worlds, but the thought of making a choice felt impossible. Mark returned from his trip that weekend, his presence a stark reminder of the life I was risking. He was attentive in his own way, asking about my week and sharing stories from his travels. But even as he tried to reconnect, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was missing. One evening, as we sat in the living room, Mark's phone buzzed with a work notification. He glanced at the screen, his expression neutral, before excusing himself to take the call. I watched him go, a pang of guilt tightening in my chest. When he returned, I forced a smile. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Just work," he said, sitting down beside me. "You know how it is." I nodded, my mind racing with unspoken thoughts. I wanted to tell him everything, to confess my feelings for Ethan and the emptiness I had felt in our marriage. But the words caught in my throat, silenced by fear and uncertainty. Instead, I leaned against him, hoping he wouldn't notice the tears welling in my eyes. Mark left for another trip on Monday morning. The sound of his suitcase wheels rolling across the hardwood floor echoed through the house as I leaned against the kitchen counter, nursing a half-finished cup of coffee. He stopped at the door, his hand resting on the doorknob. For a moment, he hesitated, his back turned to me. "Call me if you need anything," he said, without looking back. "I will," I replied, my voice calm and steady, but inside I felt like a storm was brewing. He opened the door, the crisp autumn air rushing in as he stepped outside. I didn't follow him to the car. I stood there, staring at the empty doorway long after he had driven away, my chest tightening with a strange mix of relief and dread. The house felt heavier in his absence, the silence oppressive. I spent the day aimlessly cleaning, trying to distract myself from the thoughts swirling in my mind. But no matter how much I scrubbed or straightened, one thought kept resurfacing. Ethan. I hadn't seen him since the night he came over, and though I tried to convince myself it was for the best, I couldn't shake the ache in my chest. His words haunted me, the way he had looked at me with such intensity, as if he could see right through me. "You deserve to be happy." What did that even mean anymore? I couldn't remember the last time I had felt truly happy, at least not with Mark. Our marriage had become a series of polite exchanges and empty routines, a hollow shell of what it once was. And then Ethan came along, reminding me of what it felt like. To be seen, to be wanted. The doorbell rang late in the afternoon, startling me out of my thoughts. My heart leapt into my throat as I hurried to the door, my pulse quickening. I knew it was him before I even opened it. Ethan stood there, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a warmth that made my chest tighten. "Hi," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hi," he replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I hope this isn't a bad time." "It's not," I said quickly, closing the door behind him. "I'm glad you came." We stood there in the foyer, the tension between us almost palpable. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching like a taut string. "Claire," he began, his voice low and steady, "I know I said I'd give you time, but I needed to see you." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I motioned for him to follow me into the kitchen, where the afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the countertops. We sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. "I've been thinking about what you said," I began, my hands fidgeting with the edge of my sweater. "About being happy." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "And I don't know what that looks like anymore," I admitted. I've spent so long pretending everything is fine that I don't even know where to start. "You start by being honest," he said gently. "With yourself, with Mark, with me." His words cut through me like a blade. I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm scared," I whispered. "I know," he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. His touch was warm, grounding, and I felt a surge of comfort I hadn't realized I needed. but you don't have to do this alone. As the hours slipped by, our conversation grew deeper, more vulnerable. Ethan told me about his own struggles, his frustrations with his job, the loneliness he felt living in a city where he knew no one. For the first time, I saw the cracks beneath his confident exterior, and it only made me feel closer to him. "It's not just about being seen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. It's about being understood, and with you, Claire, I feel like I finally have that." His words brought tears to my eyes. I reached across the table, my fingers brushing against his. "I feel the same way," I admitted, my voice barely audible. He stood then, his chair scraping against the floor as he came around to my side of the table. He knelt in front of me, his hands resting on my knees, as he looked up at me with an intensity that made my heart race. "Then let me be there for you," he said softly. "Whatever you decide, whatever happens, I'm here." I didn't have the strength to resist him anymore. I leaned forward, my hands cupping his face as I kissed him. It was a kiss filled with desperation, longing, and a deep, unspoken need. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer as the rest of the world faded away. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment like glass. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I pulled away from Ethan. "It's Mark," I whispered, panic setting in. He wasn't supposed to be back until Friday. Ethan's eyes widened and he stood quickly, his gaze darting toward the back door. "What do you want me to do?" I glanced toward the front door, the sound of Mark's footsteps growing louder as he approached. "Go out the back," I said hurriedly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll cover for you." He hesitated for a moment, his hand brushing against mine. "Claire—" "Go," I said firmly, pushing him toward the door. "Please." "Oh." He nodded, slipping out the back just as Mark stepped inside. I turned to face my husband, my heart racing as I tried to compose myself. "You're back early," I said, forcing a smile. "Flight got canceled," he said, his tone casual as he set his suitcase down. "Figured I'd surprise you." "Well, you definitely succeeded," I said, my voice trembling slightly. Mark's gaze lingered on me for a moment, his brow furrowing. "Everything okay?" "Of course," I said quickly, avoiding his eyes. "Just caught off guard, that's all." He nodded, but there was a flicker of suspicion in his expression that made my stomach churn. As he moved past me into the living room, I let out a shaky breath, my mind racing. Ethan was gone, but the consequences of our actions were still very much here. And for the first time, I realized that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the lies I was telling, the life I was risking, and the people I was hurting. The tension in the house was suffocating that evening. Mark was unusually attentive, asking about my day and offering to help with dinner. I tried to act normal, but the weight of what had just happened made it impossible to relax. When he went to bed that night, I stayed in the kitchen, staring out the window into the dark backyard. My phone buzzed on the counter, and I picked it up to see a message from Ethan. I stared at the screen for a long moment, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Finally, I typed a single word. "Yes." But as I set the phone down, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope stretched thin between two lives. Mark had grown more attentive since his surprise return, a shift that both comforted and unnerved me. He began asking more questions about my day, my feelings, even mundane details like the errands I ran. I couldn't tell if it was genuine interest or suspicion, but either way, it left me on edge. Ethan, too, was a constant presence in my mind. His absence in the house contrasted sharply with the indelible mark he had left on my heart. Though I told myself it was best to give us space, I found myself staring at my phone late at night, rereading our brief messages, and wondering if I'd made a mistake letting him leave that day. I hadn't seen him since, but the air between us felt far from resolved. And the weight of my guilt, coupled with the pull I still felt toward Ethan, was becoming impossible to bear. It was a Wednesday evening when everything came to a head. Mark had finished an early dinner and retreated to his study to catch up on work. I stayed in the kitchen pretending to clean up, though my thoughts were miles away. I kept stealing glances at my phone, willing it to buzz with a message from Ethan, even as I chastised myself for the hope. The sound of footsteps behind me jolted me from my thoughts. I turned to see Mark standing in the doorway, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. "Claire," he said, his tone unusually serious. "Can we talk?" "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile. "What's on your mind?" He stepped into the room, pulling out one of the kitchen chairs and sitting down. The way he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, made my stomach churn. I set the dishcloth down and sat across from him, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling. I've been thinking a lot lately," he began, his eyes meeting mine. "About us. About our marriage." My heart thudded painfully in my chest. "Okay?" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I know. I haven't been around as much as I should, and I know that's been hard on you." I nodded slowly, unsure of where he was going with this. "I've been trying to make changes," he continued, "to be more present, to show you that I care." The guilt hit me like a tidal wave. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. Mark, I... but things feels off," he said, cutting me off. His gaze sharpened and his voice grew quieter. "I feel like there's a distance between us, like you're holding something back." The air left my lungs. What do you mean?" "I mean," he paused, his expression conflicted. I feel like I don't know you anymore." His words hit me harder than I expected. The truth was, he was right. The woman he thought he knew, the woman I had tried so hard to be, was slipping further away with each passing day. "Mark," I said softly, my voice trembling. "I don't know what to say." "Just be honest with me," he said, leaning closer. "If there's something going on, I want to know. I need to know." The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket. This was my chance to come clean, to tell him everything, and finally face the consequences of my actions. But as I opened my mouth to speak, fear gripped me. Before I could decide what to say, the sound of a notification buzzing on my phone shattered the silence. My breath caught in my throat. As Mark's gaze shifted to the counter where my phone sat, the screen lit up with a message. "Who's that?" he asked, his tone sharp. "No one," I said quickly, standing up and reaching for the phone. But Mark was faster. He grabbed it before I could, his eyes scanning the screen. His jaw tightened as he read the name on the notification. "Ethan," he said flatly, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. Hurt, anger, betrayal. "Mark, I can explain," I began, my words tumbling over each other as panic set in. "Explain what?" he demanded, standing up and holding the phone out of reach. "Who is he?" I hesitated, searching for the right words. "He's just a friend. A friend? Mark's voice rose, his disbelief clear. Claire, don't lie to me. I'm not lying, I insisted, though the words felt hollow even to me. Mark stared at me, his expression hardening. Then why is he texting you at 9 o'clock at night, and why haven't you mentioned him before? The room seemed to close in around me. My chest tightened as I realized there was no way out of this conversation without telling the truth, or at least part of it. He's a delivery driver, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. We've talked a few times, that's all. Mark's eyes narrowed. A delivery driver? He shook his head, his disbelief turning into anger. Jesus, Claire, do you think I'm an idiot? I'm not lying, I said again, my voice trembling. It's nothing. Then why do you look so guilty? He shot back, his voice cutting through me like a blade. Tears welled in my eyes, and I turned away, unable to face the intensity of his gaze. Because I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Mark fell silent, his anger giving way to confusion. What are you talking about? I took a shaky breath, my hands gripping the edge of the counter for support. I don't know how we got here, I said, my voice breaking. I feel like I've been living someone else's life for years, and I don't know how to fix it. Claire, Mark's voice softened, but I couldn't bring myself to look at him. I don't want to hurt you, I continued, the words tumbling out in a rush, but I can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's not. The silence that followed was deafening. I finally turned to face him, my heart pounding as I waited for his response. I didn't realize you felt that way, he said quietly, his expression unreadable. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't know how, I admitted, tears streaming down my face, and because I didn't want to admit it to myself. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. So where does that leave us? I don't know, I said honestly. I just know that I can't keep living like this. He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the conversation had finally caught up with him. Neither can I. Mark left the room shortly after that, retreating to his study without another word. I stayed in the kitchen, staring out the window as the night deepened. My phone buzzed again, but this time I didn't check it. I couldn't bear to face the reality of what had just happened, or the uncertainty of what came next. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Mark slept in the guest room, and though we exchanged a few strained words the next morning, the tension between us was undeniable. For the first time in years, I felt like the cracks in our marriage were too deep to mend. Ethan's message remained unread on my phone, a silent reminder of the choices I had yet to make. I didn't know if I had the strength to reply, or if I even deserved the chance to try. The following days were suffused with a suffocating silence. Mark left for work early and returned late, his usual phone calls or quick texts absent. At home, we circled each other like strangers, speaking only when necessary. Every word between us felt weighted, every glance laced with unspoken questions. I was drowning in guilt, but I couldn't find the courage to break the fragile truce. Ethan, too, remained a looming presence in my thoughts. His unread message on my phone became an invisible tether, pulling at my resolve. I wanted to talk to him, to explain everything, or maybe just to feel the comfort of his voice one more time. But each time I reached for my phone, the memory of Mark's expression held me back. One afternoon, I decided to clean the guest room. Mark had been sleeping there since our confrontation, and though I told myself it was just to keep busy, part of me hoped the act might ease the tension between us. I stripped the sheets, fluffed the pillows, and dusted the furniture. letting the rhythm of the work soothe my restless mind. As I reached for the nightstand to wipe it down, my hand brushed against Mark's phone. It buzzed softly, the screen lighting up with a notification. I glanced at it instinctively, my heart lurching when I saw the message. "Well, let me know if you want to talk anytime." The name attached was unfamiliar, but the tone of the message was unmistakable. My pulse quickened as I stared at the screen. 1,000 questions flooding my mind. I knew I shouldn't jump to conclusions. I knew I shouldn't let my own guilt color my interpretation, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. I set the phone down carefully as though it might shatter under my touch, and finished cleaning in a daze. By the time Mark returned home that evening, I had convinced myself to let it go. Whatever the message meant, it wasn't my place to question him, not after everything I had done. That resolve crumbled a week later. Mark came home earlier than expected, his tie loosened and his expression weary. I was in the living room, flipping through a magazine I wasn't really reading, when he sat down across from me. "Claire," he said, his voice unusually soft, "we need to talk." The words sent a jolt of apprehension through me. I set the magazine aside, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "Okay." He hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the coffee table before returning to me. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how you feel." I nodded, my throat tightening. And I think we need to be honest with each other," he said, his tone careful. "About everything." My breath caught in my chest. "What do you mean?" I mean, he ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening. "I've been talking to someone." The room seemed to tilt around me. I stared at him, my heart pounding as his words sank in. "Talking to someone?" I repeated, my voice trembling. "She's just a friend," he said quickly, his tone defensive. Someone I met through work. We've been talking about things, about how I've been feeling." The knot in my chest tightened. "Feeling about what?" "About us," he admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "About how distant we've been, how hard it's been to connect." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The irony of the situation was almost unbearable. Here we were, two people trapped in the same marriage, both seeking solace in places we shouldn't. "And what have you been telling her?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Nothing inappropriate," he said quickly, his gaze snapping back to mine. "I swear, Claire, it's just been conversations. She's been helping me work through some things." "Helping you," I said, my voice rising. "Mark, do you even hear yourself? You're turning to someone else to fix problems in our marriage." He flinched at my tone, his expression hardening. "And what about you?" he shot back. "Who's Ethan, Claire? Because last I checked, you weren't exactly running to me to fix things either." His words hit me like a slap. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. The silence that followed was deafening, a chasm opening between us that felt impossible to bridge. The argument that followed was like nothing we had ever experienced. Years of resentment, guilt, and unspoken truths spilled out in angry words and accusations. By the time it was over, we were both left raw and exhausted. The fragile foundation of our marriage cracked beyond repair. Mark slept in the guest room that night, and for the first time, I didn't care. I stayed up late, pacing the living room as I replayed the fight over and over in my mind. Every word felt like a wound, every accusation a reminder of how far we had drifted from the people we once were. The next morning, Mark left for work without saying a word. The house felt emptier than ever, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. I stared at my phone for a long time before finally picking it up and opening Ethan's message. "Are you okay?" The simplicity of his words brought tears to my eyes. I typed a response before I could second guess myself. "No. Can we talk?" His reply came almost immediately. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. When Ethan arrived, I was waiting for him in the kitchen, my hands trembling as I clutched a mug of tea I hadn't touched. He stepped inside, his expression filled with concern. "Claire," he said softly, crossing the room to stand in front of me. "What's going on?" I shook my head, tears spilling down my cheeks. "Everything's falling apart," I whispered. "I don't know what to do." He reached for me, his hands resting gently on my shoulders. "Tell me what happened." I told him everything. About the fight with Mark, about the message I had seen on his phone, about the unbearable weight of my guilt. Ethan listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, he pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly as I sobbed against his chest. "You're stronger than you think," he murmured. "You'll get through this." "But what if I don't?" I asked, my voice breaking. "What if I've already destroyed everything?" Ethan pulled back just enough to look at me, his hands cradling my face. "Then you start over," he said firmly. "You deserve to be happy, Claire. And you deserve to be with someone who makes you feel that way." His words cut through my despair, a glimmer of hope breaking through the darkness. I didn't know what the future held, but in that moment I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep living in limbo. It was time to make a choice. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Mark's car pulling out of the driveway. The faint rumble of the engine faded into the distance, leaving the house in an eerie stillness. I sat up in bed, staring at the empty space beside me. It had been days since we'd shared the same room, let alone a meaningful conversation. The divide between us felt insurmountable, and yet a small, stubborn part of me clung to the hope that we could find a way back. But then there was Ethan. His words from the day before echoed in my mind. "You deserve to be happy." It wasn't the first time he'd said it, but this time I couldn't brush it aside. Happiness. The idea felt foreign, almost unattainable. Could I truly find it again? And if so, with whom? I spent the morning pacing the house, my thoughts a chaotic swirl. Every room held memories of Mark and me, the good, the bad, and everything in between. I couldn't ignore the history we had built together, but I also couldn't ignore the hollow ache that had settled into our marriage. It wasn't just about Ethan. It was about me, about the woman I had become, trapped in a life that no longer felt like my own. By midday, I found myself standing in front of the kitchen counter, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. I had written 2 messages, each one destined for a different man. The first was for Mark, a plea for honesty, for clarity, for a chance to fix what was broken. The second was for Ethan, a promise to meet him, to finally let go of the fear and see where our connection might lead. My finger hovered over the screen, indecision paralyzing me. Each choice felt monumental, a path that would alter the course of my life forever. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. And then I pressed send. The cafe was small and tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place where secrets could be whispered without fear of being overheard. Ethan was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with his hands clasped in front of him. His eyes lit up when he saw me, a mixture of relief and anticipation crossing his face. "Claire," he said softly as I approached. He stood, pulling out a chair for me. "Hi," I murmured, sitting down. My hands trembled slightly as I folded them in my lap. The weight of my decision pressed heavily on me, but I knew there was no turning back. We sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the cafe fading into the background. Finally, Ethan leaned forward, his gaze steady. "What's on your mind?" I looked at him, my chest tightening. I sent Mark a message this morning," I said. "Told him we need to talk. Really talk." Ethan nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "And what about us?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I searched his face, seeing the hope and vulnerability in his eyes. He deserved an answer, one that was honest, one that didn't string him along. "I don't know what the future holds," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But I know that I can't keep living the way I've been. I need to figure out who I am again, what I want." Ethan reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "And do I fit into that future?" he asked quietly. Tears stung my eyes as I nodded. "You do, but I need to face this with Mark first. I need to end things the right way, if that's even possible." "I understand," he said, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "I'll wait for you, Claire, as long as it takes." His words broke something inside me, a dam I hadn't realized was holding back years of fear, regret, and longing. I squeezed his hand, my tears spilling over. "Thank you," I whispered. That evening, I returned home to find Mark sitting in the living room, his shoulders slumped and his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He looked up as I entered, his expression weary. "You wanted to talk," he said simply. I nodded, sitting down across from him. The words I had rehearsed in my head all day suddenly felt inadequate, but I forced myself to speak. "Mark, I think we've been lying to ourselves for a long time about who we are, about what this marriage has become." He sighed, leaning back against the couch. "You're right," he admitted. "I felt it too, but I didn't want to face it." "Neither did I said, my voice breaking. "But we can't keep pretending anymore. It's not fair to either of us." For a long moment, he was silent. Then he nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "So what do we do now?" "I think we need time apart," I said carefully, "to figure out what we really want, whether it's each other or something else." Mark looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "I never wanted it to end like this," he said softly. "Neither did I replied, tears spilling down my cheeks. "But maybe this isn't the end. Maybe it's just a new beginning." We sat there in silence, the weight of our shared history pressing down on us. It wasn't an ending, not entirely. It was the start of something new, something unknown. The weeks that followed were filled with uncertainty. Mark moved out temporarily, and we agreed to keep the lines of communication open as we navigated the unfamiliar terrain of separation. It wasn't easy, but for the first time in years, I felt a sense of clarity. Ethan and I stayed in touch, though we kept our distance. He was patient, understanding, never pressuring me for more than I could give, and though the future remained uncertain, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. I was beginning to find myself again, piece by piece, and no matter what lay ahead, I knew one thing for sure: I deserved to be happy.